The sun had not yet risen over the hills of Maryland when Brigadier General John C. Caldwell stirred beneath his blanket. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of wet canvas and horse sweat. A mist clung to the open fields, shrouding the army in a ghostly veil. Around him, the low murmurs of men rising from sleep carried through the bivouac. Tin cups clinked. A sergeant cursed a stubborn fire. Somewhere a fifer tuned a familiar tune, though half-heartedly. Caldwell sat upright and reached for his boots, grimacing as he pulled them on. He had not slept much. He rarely did. At 31, he was one of the youngest generals in the Army of the Potomac, and he bore that fact like a weight strapped to his shoulders. A schoolteacher before the war, a legislator by accident, he had risen quickly. Too quickly, some muttered. Antietam had seen him tested. Chancellorsville had demanded more. Now the test would come again, though he did not yet know its name would be Gettysburg. He stepped out of his tent into the pale light of dawn. His men, nearly 4,000 of them, were stirring, some still groggy, others already shouldering their gear with practiced efficiency. They were veterans now, though many bore scars from earlier trials. He saw familiar faces among the 1st Brigade, Cross of New Hampshire, sharp-eyed and stern, already walking the line with a quiet intensity. Zook was nearby, speaking low to a lieutenant, his voice calm but commanding. Brooke, ever restless, rode among the ranks of the 4th Brigade, his mount slick with dew. Caldwell paused and looked west. The war had pulled them northward, out of Virginia's blasted farms and into the rolling fields of Pennsylvania. Rumors buzzed in every camp. Lee had crossed the Potomac. The Confederates were foraging in York. There had been a clash at a town called Gettysburg. He had studied Latin and logic before ever touching a sword, but now he commanded men in life and death. The absurdity of it no longer surprised him. It was the war's way. Quick judgments, accelerated lives, boys becoming legends or corpses by sunset. And through it all, he tried to remain composed, thoughtful, deliberate. He owed them that. A courier galloped up the muddy road from Corps headquarters, his uniform spattered, his face tight with urgency. Caldwell met him halfway. A dispatch from General Hancock. The 2nd Corps would march within the hour, destination uncertain. He handed the note to his aide without a word. The boy read it aloud, but Caldwell heard none of it. He was watching the sky instead, where the mist had begun to lift. A warm breeze stirred the tall grass. Somewhere in those hills, Lee's army was moving. The pieces were falling into place. He turned back to his staff. Saddle the horses, rouse the division. We march at once. And so they did. 4 brigades, 16 regiments, marching north toward destiny. None among them knew that the place called Gettysburg would enter their lives and never leave it. They would cross wheatfields and rocky slopes, lose friends and leaders, hold stone walls and shattered ground. And through it all, Caldwell would lead, not as a hero, not as a villain, but as a man bound by duty, conscience, and the fierce hope that somehow this terrible war might end. They reached the field in the gray of morning on July 2nd, the last of the columns straggling into position along the Taneytown road. Dust hung in the air, churned by the endless press of boots, hooves, and wheels. Brigadier General Caldwell rode near the head of his division, scanning the ridge ahead through weary eyes. The ground sloped gently upward toward Cemetery Hill. Beyond it, invisible behind folds of farmland and broken fences, the Confederate army waited. General Hancock met them near a stand of trees, seated stiffly in his saddle, his face unreadable. Caldwell saluted, and Hancock gave his orders crisply. The 1st Division was to take position on the left of Gibbon's 2nd Division, held in reserve for now. Columns of regiments by brigades, be ready to move. Caldwell nodded. He knew what that meant. He had learned it at Fredericksburg and again at Chancellorsville. Stand ready, and the moment things go wrong, you will be called into the fire. The men fanned out into position, sweating under heavy packs. Officers shouted over the rattle of canteens and musket slings. Flags rose, regiments settled. Behind them, the open fields stretched south and west toward the Emmitsburg Road, dotted with orchards, barns, and shallow ridges. Somewhere out there, Lee's army was moving. Longstreet's veterans, Hood's Texans, the Georgians of Kershaw and Wofford. Caldwell could not see them, but he felt them. Early afternoon brought movement. Word passed down that the 2nd Corps was advancing. Skirmishers traded shots near the Emmitsburg Road. Caldwell mounted and prepared his staff. He received orders to support the advance, and his men began to shift forward. Then came the reversal. Columns of the 5th Corps suddenly emerged, marching across their front to reinforce the line. The advance was halted. Caldwell's division, half moved, was ordered back to its original ground. He turned his horse and shouted the new orders, his voice taut with frustration. Soldiers cursed under their breath. The sun climbed higher. Still they waited. Around 4 o'clock, cannon thundered in the distance. The sound rolled over the fields like distant drums. Caldwell turned toward the southwest, where black smoke began to rise from the Union left. The Third Corps had advanced too far, stretched thin along a salient. Now they were breaking. An officer from Hancock's staff galloped in, breathless, orders from General Meade. The left was collapsing. Caldwell's entire division was to move at once and report to General Sykes near the Wheatfield. Caldwell did not hesitate. He gave the signal, and the division stepped off by the left flank. Officers rode ahead. Lieutenant Daniel Cross, calm as ever, galloped forward to locate Sykes. Caldwell moved with the column, pushing them to hurry. The reports were dire. The Confederates were pressing hard. The Third Corps was falling back in confusion. If the Union left collapsed entirely, the whole line might be rolled up. The march was quick and rough. Men tripped over stones and tangled in brush. Some fell behind. But they moved, brigade after brigade, through woods and over uneven ground. The air smelled of powder. The sound of musket fire grew louder with each step. Somewhere ahead, good men were dying. As they neared the Wheatfield, an officer, perhaps from Sykes' staff, galloped up and pointed. That was their ground. Right of the Fifth Corps, left of the shattered remnants of the Third. Drive the enemy back. Hold the line. Caldwell nodded, turned in the saddle, and gave the order. His men wheeled into position, banners snapping in the breeze. 4 brigades moved toward the crucible, unaware they were marching into one of the most savage corners of the entire war. The wheat stood tall and golden, waving gently in the wind. Soon it would be trampled, burned, and stained. And the men of Caldwell's division would write their chapter in blood and fire. The air grew hotter as the division neared the edge of the field. Cannon smoke drifted low across the trees, clinging to the underbrush like morning fog. The sound of rifles cracked in staccato bursts, rising to a steady roar ahead. Men spoke little now. Officers barked orders in clipped tones. The field, flat, open, sunlit, lay just beyond the tree line, a swaying ocean of wheat bordered by rocks and woods. Somewhere within it, the enemy was waiting. Caldwell reined in at the edge of the clearing and studied the ground. To his left, the woods bent in a shallow arc. To his right, the land rose toward a low, rocky crest. Beyond that, the Third Corps was disintegrating. Stragglers drifted past in ones and twos, faces blackened with smoke, eyes wide with confusion. They had seen something Caldwell's men had not yet seen, but they would. He ordered Colonel Cross and the 1st Brigade forward in line of battle. Their left was to anchor on the woods, their right stretching toward the center of the Wheatfield. Cross gave a brief nod, then turned to his men. His voice was steady, deliberate. They advanced with bayonets fixed, muskets at the ready, banners forward. Caldwell watched them go, the lines moving with eerie precision into the open grain. The sunlight glinted off rifle barrels and brass buttons. Cross's dark hair shone under his kepi. He moved like a man who had already accepted whatever fate lay ahead. Almost at once, the crackle of fire erupted from the woods. Cross's line returned it with a deafening volley. Smoke burst from the wheat like cannon blasts. Men staggered, dropped, pressed forward. Within moments the entire line was engaged. Caldwell gave the order to commit the 2nd Brigade. They formed on Cross's right and surged forward, musketry roaring. Officers shouted above the din. The wheat bent and snapped beneath their boots. Somewhere in the haze, Union blue and Confederate gray closed the distance. Men fought at 50 yards, then 20, then 10. To the right, he sent the 3rd Brigade to link with the remnants of the Third Corps. The line stretched thin, curling slightly as it wrapped the edge of the Wheatfield. Behind them, he held the 4th Brigade in reserve, ready to strike when the moment came. He could see now that the Wheatfield was a trap. The ground rolled unevenly, broken by boulders and sudden swales. Visibility was short. Maneuver was limited. Every inch had to be earned in sweat and blood. But his men did not falter. Colonel Cross pushed forward with grim determination, driving the enemy steadily toward the far edge of the field. His brigade's fire was relentless, disciplined. The Confederates gave ground reluctantly, but they gave it. Cross's voice carried through the smoke, stern, commanding, until suddenly it stopped. Caldwell turned sharply and scanned the field. Word came quickly. Cross was down, wounded, badly. He clenched his jaw and gave the next order. The 4th Brigade, under Colonel Brooke, would go in. The time had come. Brooke moved with confidence, his men sweeping into the Wheatfield with bayonets gleaming. They advanced past the exhausted remnants of the 1st Brigade, climbed the shallow rise, and struck the enemy hard. Confederate lines buckled. The bluecoats pressed forward, reaching the crest that overlooked the tangled woods beyond. Caldwell galloped behind the lines, directing reserves, shouting encouragement, pointing officers to weak spots. Smoke curled around his horse's legs. The roar of battle was unending. Amid the noise, word reached him that General Zook had fallen too. Another friend, another name for the list. But the crest was theirs. The men of the 1st, 2nd, and 4th Brigades stood bloodied but unbroken, holding a position that had changed hands again and again that day. With reinforcements it might be held. Caldwell believed that. He called for support from Barnes's division. One brigade, just one, might anchor the flanks and make the line secure. Barnes responded. Colonel Schweitzer's brigade began moving forward, stepping cautiously into the fire-swept Wheatfield. For a moment, Caldwell allowed himself to hope. He turned his horse toward the left, seeking connection with General Ayres of the 5th Corps. As he galloped through the haze, he could see his men locking bayonets, pouring fire, refusing to yield. Behind them, the wheat smoldered. Ahead, the Confederates were recoiling. The position was not yet lost. Not yet. Caldwell rode hard to the left, weaving through bursts of musket fire and drifting smoke. The terrain here was treacherous, strewn with boulders and stumps, rising unevenly toward a jumble of trees where Ayres's men were supposed to be holding. He saw scattered figures in blue, crouched behind rocks, firing toward the woods. They were holding, but barely, and Caldwell's own brigades had advanced beyond them. He pulled up sharply on the reins. His line, Brooks', Kelly's, McKean's, was dangerously exposed. They had surged forward in perfect coordination, driving the Confederates across the Wheatfield and up the rocky rise. But in doing so, they had outpaced the flanks. Ayres met him near a shallow ravine, his face lined with strain. He recognized the danger immediately. His line was behind Caldwell's left, leaving a yawning gap. Without a word, Ayres signaled his men to move forward. A Union brigade rose from cover and advanced in staggered formation, struggling to close the distance. But the right was another matter. Caldwell turned his horse again, this time toward the opposite flank. What he saw chilled him. The Union right had crumbled. Through the drifting smoke and broken undergrowth, he could see bluecoats streaming to the rear in 2s and 3s, some without muskets, others looking over their shoulders in fear. Regiments were dissolving into panicked mobs. Officers shouted to rally them, but the tide had turned. The right flank, once anchored by the 3rd Corps, had shattered completely. The enemy wasted no time. Gray-clad infantry surged forward, shouting as they poured over the rocks and through the trees, swinging toward Caldwell's exposed right. Within moments, they were behind his line, firing into the backs of his men. He reacted at once. Galloping back toward the center, Caldwell shouted orders above the noise, his voice hoarse but urgent. Signal the withdrawal. Regiments that had just seized the crest were now pivoting, falling back through the same ground they had fought to capture. Some fired as they moved. Others ran. The enemy was already pouring into the gap like water through a broken dam, but the division did not rout. Officers like Colonel McKean and Colonel Brooke barked orders, rallying their men in motion. The retreat was painful and chaotic, but not a stampede. Color-bearers turned their flags and moved with purpose. Artillery on the ridge behind them opened fire, covering the withdrawal with shell and canister. The Wheatfield, now a smoking ruin, was abandoned. Caldwell's horse stumbled on the uneven ground. He dismounted and led it by the reins, shouting for order, helping gather broken units. Behind a stone wall near the edge of the field, survivors began to regroup. Men gasped for air, hands shaking, faces smeared with powder and blood. Ammunition was nearly gone. Some had fixed bayonets for the last desperate push that never came. He found Colonel Brooks seated on a rock, his uniform torn, a slash across his cheek. Nearby, Lieutenant Colonel Fraser barked commands, helping to realign his battered regiment. McKean limped past with a bandaged hand, still leading. These were soldiers who had given all they had, and still stood. As dusk fell, the lines quieted. The Confederates did not pursue. They had won the field, but not the victory. Caldwell stood behind the wall, watching the shadows lengthen across the torn ground. The wheat no longer swayed. It lay trampled, blackened, soaked through. They had come so close. He looked toward the woods where Cross and Zook had fallen. He thought of the notes he would have to write, the names he would have to say aloud, the families who would read words like gallant, brave, and killed instantly. He turned to his staff and gave the final order of the day. Hold this line, no farther back. And through the night under the stars they did. The morning of July 3rd broke slowly. A pale light crept over the hills, casting long shadows across the fields and fences. Dew clung to every blade of grass. For the men of Caldwell's division, there had been no tents, no fires, and no rest. They had slept where they stopped, if they slept at all, lying on damp ground behind stone walls and thickets, muskets within arm's reach. Caldwell stood near a low ridge, arms folded across his chest, surveying the battered remnants of his division. What had begun as 4 strong brigades was now a collection of depleted regiments, their flags torn, their numbers thinned. Yet they still held formation. The men were quiet, hollow-eyed, but steady. By dawn, Caldwell had received new orders. The division was to fall back to its original ground, near the center of the 2nd Corps line, where the ridge curved gently southward behind a slight rise. From there, they would form a single line and dig in. Dig. The word felt strange to some of the older soldiers, men who still thought of war as maneuver and valor, not earthworks and spades. But Caldwell gave the order firmly, and the men obeyed. With bayonets, tin cups, and bare hands, they began scraping the dry soil into shallow breastworks. Stones were stacked, logs hauled, cartridge boxes stayed within reach. By mid-morning the line had taken shape, a crude but serviceable defense, barely knee-high in places, but enough to give cover. Caldwell walked behind the line, inspecting the work, speaking briefly to company officers, nodding to the men. He said little. They all knew what was coming. Around noon, the sky cracked open. A single cannon fired, then another. Within seconds, the entire Confederate artillery line erupted. Shells screamed overhead, bursting in columns of smoke and flame. Solid shot tore through branches. Explosions shook the ground. It was as if the sky itself had turned against them. Caldwell dropped beside a section of stone wall as the blast wave rolled over him. The roar was unending, 1 hour of the heaviest fire he had ever experienced, and yet miraculously his men suffered few losses, 1 man killed, a handful wounded. The breastworks had done their job. Still, the men lay flat, faces pressed into the dirt, hands clenched over their ears. Horses bolted, trees splintered. The very air seemed to pulse with the fury of it. Then, just as suddenly, silence. A strange, aching quiet fell over the ridge. Caldwell rose slowly, brushing dust from his coat. In the distance across the fields, he saw them. Confederates, a long gray line emerging from the woods, stepping in perfect rhythm, flags waving, bayonets gleaming. It was not the full assault. Those were breaking against the center, but a smaller force, perhaps a brigade, angled directly toward Caldwell's position. He turned and called to the nearest battery. Artillery crews sprang to life. Cannons roared once more, this time in answer. Shells burst over the advancing Confederates, tearing gaps in their formation. Caldwell's infantry added their fire, calm and measured, each volley ripping into the line. The gray wave faltered, buckled, and then collapsed. Some fled. Many dropped their muskets and raised their hands. Dozens came forward in a slow, stunned walk, surrendering without resistance. They were boys, mostly, pale, wide-eyed, half-starved. The Union line held without breaking a sweat. Caldwell lowered his field glasses and nodded. This assault had failed before it began. Whatever Lee had intended with this last push, it had found no weakness here. He looked down the line and saw the colors still flying, saw the men he had marched with from Virginia still standing, fewer now, but no less proud. This was not a glorious victory. It was not even triumph. It was survival, bought with courage and discipline and the ground they had refused to yield. And at last the field fell silent. Night came quietly. No bugles sounded. No cheers rose. The ridge that had held through the fire of 3 days now lay still beneath a sky of scattered stars. Campfires burned low, flickering against the makeshift breastworks. Men wrapped themselves in blankets and leaned against stone walls, too tired to speak, too numb to sleep. The noise of battle had faded, replaced by the distant creak of wagons, the groan of stretchers, and the soft murmur of field surgeons still at work. Caldwell sat beside a stump, writing by candlelight. His face was streaked with grime, his coat was torn at the sleeve, a blood-stained handkerchief lay folded beside his journal. He paused often, staring into the darkness, trying to find the right words. He had written the names already. Cross, Zook, Roberts, Merwin. Each name came with a memory, a moment on a battlefield, a voice in a council of war, a quiet joke shared on a cold night. These were not just officers lost in a report. They were the soul of the division. And now they were gone. Caldwell rose and walked the line. He passed regiments reduced to companies, colors still lifted by weary arms. He stopped near the remains of the 1st Brigade. McKean sat on a crate, head bowed, hands wrapped in stained linen. A corporal stood nearby with one boot off, his foot wrapped in rags, humming something tuneless into the night. Farther along, Colonel Brooke lay on a bedroll, eyes closed but not asleep. His chest rose and fell steadily. His hat lay beside him, riddled with holes from where a bullet had grazed his scalp. He had not spoken since the fighting ended, but he was alive. Caldwell looked up toward the stars. Somewhere out there, beyond the woods and farms, the enemy was retreating. Lee's army, bloodied and repulsed, was slipping back into the hills of western Maryland. The great gamble had failed, but there was no celebration here, only exhaustion. He passed a lantern propped on a fence post and saw Corporal Parmalee nearby, standing watch with musket in hand. The young cavalryman nodded to his general and said nothing. He had followed orders, steadied panicked men, carried messages under fire. Caldwell made a mental note to write again to headquarters. The boy had earned his promotion. Near the end of the line, 2 soldiers sat by a small fire, roasting what little they had. One offered a piece of hardtack to the other, who accepted it with a faint smile. Small mercies, shared in silence. Caldwell returned to his journal and finished the page. The enemy has been driven back. My division, though diminished, remains in the line. The men have done their duty with courage and resolution. No further action is expected tonight. He closed the book and set it aside. At last he allowed himself to sit still. The sounds of the camp drifted over him like a lullaby, the soft click of a ramrod, the rustle of a blanket, the sigh of a horse shifting in its tether. The stars above shone indifferent. They had held the line, they had not broken, and that for now was enough. The sun rose on July 4th with a stillness that felt unreal. No guns fired, no lines advanced. The battlefield, once deafening and alive with chaos, now lay quiet under a pale blue sky. A breeze moved gently through the trees, carrying with it the smell of smoke, sweat, and something else, something older. The scent of blood-soaked earth. Caldwell stood beside a stone wall near his old position. His coat was buttoned but wrinkled, his boots coated in dust. He had slept little, neither had the men. They had stood to arms before dawn as ordered, but no attack came. Instead, they waited. Across the field he could see shapes moving. Not formations, not charges, just small details now, burial crews, ambulance wagons, scattered sentries watching from the high ground. The ridge was quiet, and for the first time in days, Caldwell let himself believe it might be over. He walked the line once more. Men leaned on muskets, some with bandaged heads or arms in slings. They looked at him as he passed, not with cheering or salutes, but with the blank, tired eyes of men who had seen too much. There were fewer now, whole companies reduced to platoons, but they still stood. Caldwell met with General Hancock near a cluster of trees. They spoke in low voices, exchanging observations and casualty numbers. There were plans to pursue, but not yet. The army needed rest. Hancock's arm was in a sling, but his posture never wavered. He asked how Caldwell's division had held after the Wheatfield. Caldwell gave the truth. They had held only because they had no other choice. Later that morning he returned to the edge of the Wheatfield. He dismounted and walked the ground on foot slowly. The tall grain was gone, crushed, burned, trampled into the dirt. Trees stood scorched and shattered. Here and there, broken muskets lay half buried in the mud. A tattered kepi, a torn cartridge belt. The field was silent now, but it had not forgotten. He reached the place where Colonel Cross had fallen. A shallow impression in the soil marked the spot. Someone had set a stone upright beside it, with no name, just a rifle stuck muzzle down in the ground. Zook's field dressing station had long since moved, but a bloodstain remained on the bark of a nearby tree. Caldwell stood for a long while, silent. He thought of the letters he had written, and those he still must. By afternoon, the clouds began to gather. Rain threatened. A messenger from headquarters rode in with new orders, prepare to march. The enemy was in retreat. The great gamble had failed. Gettysburg was behind them. He returned to his command. The men were already packing, folding blankets, checking their weapons, tightening straps. The wounded would be left in field hospitals. The dead, where they had fallen, until the gravediggers reached them. War did not wait for morning. Caldwell mounted his horse and looked down the line. He saw Colonel McKean adjusting a map beside a sergeant. He saw Corporal Parmalee helping a limping private with his pack. He saw men who had been boys the week before, now changed in ways that would not show on any casualty list. The bugle sounded. The column began to move. Caldwell gave one last glance to the hills behind them, to the place where the lines had bent but not broken, where men had stood firm while the world roared. Then he turned his horse to the south and rode forward into whatever came next. Years later, long after the rifles had fallen silent and the flags had been furled, John C. Caldwell returned to Gettysburg. He came not as a general, nor even as a soldier. The war had ended, the armies had gone home, and the years had settled upon him with the quiet weight of time. His hair had grayed, his gait had slowed, but the fields still remembered. It was late summer when he arrived, the sky high and cloudless. Tourists wandered the paths now, following maps and reading markers. Children climbed the rocks of Devil's Den. A brass band played somewhere near the cemetery. But Caldwell walked alone, dressed plainly, unnoticed by most. He paused at the edge of the wheat field. The grain had returned, tall and golden as it had been that July day. The land no longer bore scars, but Caldwell saw them all the same. Here was where Cross had charged. There, the knoll where Brooks' men had reached the crest. Over that rise, Zook had fallen. He stepped off the path and moved slowly among the stones and plaques, reading names, touching weathered bronze with gloved fingers. The monument stood in neat rows now, regimental markers carved with dates, flags, and proud inscriptions. Each one tried to explain something that could never be explained. They spoke of gallantry, sacrifice, and honor, but none of them spoke of the noise, the confusion, the sudden terror when a line gave way. None could capture the moment when a friend fell beside you, or the way a man aged 10 years in an hour. Caldwell stopped at the base of a simple shaft bearing the name of the 5th New Hampshire. He removed his hat. The men he had led were gone, some buried nearby, some far from here. Others had returned home to live out quiet lives, raising families, opening shops, writing letters that never mentioned the war. A few still wrote to him now and then. The handwriting had grown shaky, but the voices were familiar. He turned to leave, then hesitated. At the corner of the Wheatfield stood a new group of visitors, clustered around a young guide. The man spoke with animation, pointing toward the tree line, explaining troop movements, casualty figures, the sequence of attacks. The group listened politely, nodding, their eyes scanning the open field. Caldwell watched them for a moment, then turned away. He did not need to hear the numbers. He had lived them. As he reached the road, he paused once more and looked back. The field was quiet. The wind moved gently through the wheat. Somewhere a bird called. He had done his duty. He had held the line, and that, even after all the years, was enough.